Thank you, Jeff, and thanks everyone for coming. Don't worry, I'm not going to read much of this. This is a sort of an academic book, which means it is not meant to be read out loud. Some would say they're not meant to be read at all, but I hope that many of you will read this. Will find this to be a different experience. The idea for some of the pictures around the room, these are cliches. And the passage that I'm going to read is related to this because I guess one of the differences in the way that I approach Wallace from some other critics is that for me there's a sort of personal element where I felt like Wallace really, a lot of the ways that Wallace was treated by critics early on I felt was the opposite of my experience with him. He was treated as this kind of hyper-intelligent, pretentious, logic nerd of some kind. And he was all those things in a way, but his books were actually a criticism, were actually often a sustained confrontation and a kind of criticism with the kind of values that intellectual people and highly educated people had. And particularly a criticism on the level of those values made them unhappy. Not only that they may make them treat other people crassly, but that they failed to find happiness themselves through a lot of what we think of as literary or intellectual values. And so, in my book, I treat a portion of Infinite Jest, his sort of masterpiece. About half the book takes place in an Alcoholics Anonymous, a halfway house, and one of the main characters is named Don Gately, who's a former burglar and drug addict who becomes a figure at the house who helps people as they come into the house. And I found that a lot of critics found the AA portions of the book to be kind of trivial or silly, or they didn't take them very seriously. They thought Wallace must really be laughing at these people. And in fact, for me, the experience was completely the opposite. The AA portions of the book were the parts of the book that were the most serious, and really the place where Wallace was saying, there's something going on in Alcoholics Anonymous that is a form of thinking that's being encouraged, that's the exact opposite of what we sort of hyper-educated, intellectual people, it teaches us the kind of opposite values, and it helps us to think outside of like these forms of thinking that are making us so unhappy, and teaches us in a way to pursue, what Freud called the point of therapy, which was ordinary unhappiness. And the center of that teaching was, the part I'm going to read is about cliches, and he said, there's nothing that intellectuals look down on more than cliches. That we think these are you'll see, I read part about it, but and he wanted us to really think about our relation to cliches and what cliches actually do for people. So that's sort of the part I'm going to read from the book. And it's in a section called Common Sense, as part of his broader sort of idea about what it meant to think about common sense. The attitude of Wallace's Alcoholics Anonymous toward common sense can be understood most clearly from the central place it accords to cliches or slogans. It has become a cliche itself for cliches and slogans to be connected culturally with lowest common denominator consumerism and politically with authoritarianism. The creative writing teacher and the 20th century literary critic would seem to agree that the cliche is among the most debased forms of communication. The sophisticated Infinite Jest reader's likely hostility toward cliches is given voice toward the beginning of the section introducing Boston Alcoholics Anonymous by freelance scriptwriter Randy Lenz and a professor and the editor of a scholarly quarterly, Jeffrey Day. Lenz and Day are both considered intellectuals within the Edit House community, and it is no accident that Day, during his intake interview, complains that there is something totalitarian and even un-American about AA's use of cliches. Lenz and Day are known for being the most difficult kind of addicts. It's the newcomers with some education that are the worst, according to one of the intake officers. They identify their whole selves with their head, and the disease makes its command headquarters in the head. Lenz and Day initially express their contempt for AA through their contempt for its reliance on and lack of suspicion about cliches. So this is Day. Day says, so then at 46 years of age, I came here to learn to live by cliches. One day at a time. Easy does it. First things first. Courage is fear that has said its prayers. Ask for help. To Don Gately, who listens to Day deliver these sarcastic lectures, Day is like a wide-open interactive textbook on the disease. If Day ever gets lucky and breaks down, Gately thinks, and comes to the front office at night to scream that he can't take it anymore and clutch at Gately's pant cuff and blubber and beg for help at any cost, Gately will get to tell Day that the thing is that the cliched directives are a lot more deep and hard to actually do, to try and live by instead of just say. This is a wisdom that is repeated and reinforced by the novel as a whole, which, despite being often lauded for its verbal originality, is studded with praise for the sometimes life-saving consolation of cliches. Even if they are just cliches, Gately thinks at one point, cliches are A, soothing, and B, remind you of common sense, and C, license the universal assent that drowns out silence. The idea that one might need to be reminded of common sense is central to AA, and at first glance it might look anti-philosophical. Isn't philosophy's job to question common sense? According to many analytic philosophers in the Cartesian tradition, yes. But for those familiar with Wittgenstein, who was a big influence on Wallace and is a theme in the book, the idea will remind them of his conception of the work of the philosopher as, quote, assembling reminders for a particular purpose. This could be a motto for Wallace's AA. AA diagnoses its members as having become estranged or alienated from what we have in common and passed down to one another, often in the form of cliches. Cliches, that is, become an important vehicle for maintaining and reproducing the form of life encouraged by AA, a form that valorizes what is common and attempts to facilitate it. Lenz and Day, in wanting to tear the cliches out of that form of life and hold them up for ridicule, are like the Wallace critics, who have seen the cliches within the novel as capable of being held out for analysis and often for ridicule, without seeing that they are part and parcel of a way of living. This is an eruption of what Wittgenstein would have called bad philosophy in the midst of AA. It's worth noting that Gately's defense of cliches is not merely pragmatic or functional, though. Cliches do not just allow the desperate addicts at Enid House to get through the day. They can also help them to achieve what the book posits as something resembling peace or grace. I didn't know that I didn't know is another of the slogans that looks so shallow for a while and then all of a sudden drops off and deepens like the lobster waters off the North Shore, Gately reflects at one point, adding that such slogans can help these poor yutzes start to get a whiff of what's true and deep, almost magic, under the shallow surface of what they're trying to do.